A couple weeks ago, pretty much completely out of the blue and within a day of each other, both Amazon and Google announced plans to develop novel nuclear reactors. Amazon has announced it's going to sink $500 million into new types of nuclear reactor, whereas Google is pursuing a really aggressive timeline to develop a whole new type of reactor and deploy it by 2030. This could mark the beginning of a new sort of nuclear power race between these two huge companies, with other companies like Meta and Microsoft, the usual suspects, joining the fray. But where has it come from? Why now? Why within a day of each other? And what implications is this going to have for the future of energy, for the future of AI, and for the future of nuclear?
Google is turning to nuclear energy to keep up with the demands of artificial intelligence.
Amazon Web Services is investing more than $500 million in nuclear energy across 3 different projects.
As you probably know, with more and more generative AI models, it means we're having to throw more and more compute power at these huge models. I mean, Studio Ghibli Chewbacca is not going to generate itself. And we're actually at the point where these huge data centers where these models are actually being run account for something like 4% of America's energy usage. And we expect that to go up to about 6% by 2026. At the same time, the people making these models, as well as the American government and others, are making big commitments to net zero by 2030, 2035, or 2040. So how can these two things coexist? So what does the electricity source for a data center have to be like? What do we need to power these huge server banks? Well, there's a few different criteria. The first one is, of course, reliability. This is probably the absolute key. These places pride themselves on having 99.99999% uptime. So being able to power them reliably and independently, this often means, separate to the grid, at least as a backup, is really important. The next one is zero carbon, or at very least low carbon. If these companies are serious about hitting these goals to decarbonize and offset or reduce all their emissions, then they're going to have to find ways to power these huge data centers without emitting a shit ton of carbon. And this is a really tricky task, especially as we're adopting these models more and more. One study showed that using something like ChatGPT or Gemini to do search results in 5 times as much carbon release as just doing a Google search to get the same results. And as we're leaning more and more on these models, these realities are going to start coming to play. But these aren't the only 2 considerations. As these data centers grow, it's really important to have scalable power sources. That means you can increase them or change them as you need as they grow. There are also some nice to have, so things like being able to produce high-grade heat, which you can do things like district heating or run factories off that heat, which is important for keeping the neighbors sweet in these areas where you're building huge dystopian server racks. Another important thing is energy density. That just means generating a lot of power in a small space. Of course, if we have a huge area of solar panels or a wind farm or something like that that takes up a load of space, that's going to limit the options to where and how you can implement these things. Now, this isn't to say we don't want to use any renewable power. Obviously, it's always going to be the case that we want to maximize the amount of renewables that we can use to reduce our carbon footprint. But that's just not always possible. Certainly, reliability is a big problem with renewables, right? At the end of the day, the sun isn't always shining, it's nighttime, and the wind isn't always blowing. So things like this limit the amount that we can use renewable energy when we need this 100% uptime. You might see this buzzword around 24/7 carbon-free power. Now, this is the kind of buzzword that's used to basically just mean nuclear power. So on some levels, to power these big data centers, nuclear power looks ideal because of its reliability, its power density, and the fact that it produces no carbon. But of course, building a nuclear power plant can take decades and can cost billions and billions of dollars. So how do we solve this problem, and how do we embrace nuclear for these types of applications where they're going to be really helpful without having to wait until the middle of this century? Option 1 is restarting or refitting older plants that are about to be decommissioned or have already been decommissioned. That's why Bill Gates is in there just single-handedly fixing up 3 Mile Island. Presumably they've sorted it out after the explosion, which Microsoft are going to use to power some of their new data centers, essentially making a deal with the people that run it to recommission parts of it following decommission a couple of years ago. The other option, instead of building one big one, just build lots of little ones. Bosh. These little reactors are called SMRs, which stands for small modular reactors. And modular actually means 2 different things in this case. Firstly, that we can modularize them and that we can just make loads of them and stick them together to make a big reactor or a small reactor, depending on what our situation needs. Modular here also means that we can take a lot of standardized mass-produced parts and build them in a factory instead of having to drag a load of people out to a field and doing it all on site. Originally, we had a thing called a first of a kind issue, and this is something we see a lot, where creating the first of a kind of something is a lot more difficult than creating the 100th version. You're ironing out all the kinks, you're training new people, you're developing new parts, you're doing a lot of the R&D, whereas making the 100th one was pretty much the exact same as making the 99th or the 57th or whatever. So the idea is if we can just mass produce these in an assembly line, they're going to be a lot cheaper. But it turns out that the innovation for these new reactors goes a lot further than just making a load of small ones in a factory and bunging them together in a field in Virginia. There's actually a lot of innovation that goes into these new types of reactors that, if they can pull them off, especially in the sort of timescales and budgets that they're hoping to, are going to be really revolutionary for how we create not just nuclear power, but power as a whole. Pretty much every modern commercial nuclear reactor that we'll see today in the world is something called a light water reactor, or LWR. This just means that they use light water, which just means normal bog standard water, to cool and moderate the reaction. Now, this kind of general principle has been the absolute standard for, like I say, pretty much every nuclear reactor up to now. And there's good reasons for this. We've matured the design more and more so that we know that they're going to work reliably and dependably, which is the most important thing. But the reactors that Google and Amazon want to have built are radically different in design. Part of a new family of reactors called Generation 4 reactors, or advanced reactors. Take a shot every time I say reactor, it's going to get tough. It's going to get tough. This means they work in a pretty different way to how these light water reactors that we see everywhere work.
Let's see Amazon's small modular reactor.
Sorry, yeah, I was using outside for some nice sort of fill light to kind of make it not seem too intense, but of course it's the middle of winter, so it's 3 p.m, it's really fucking dark, so it's going to be a cozy video from now on. We're going to get cozy. Amazon are supporting this company called X Energy, which is developing a reactor called the XE100. It's all very sort of transformery. Instead of being water-based like all the reactors that we were talking about that currently exist, it's going to be helium-based, which means it's going to use helium as its coolant to take energy away from the reaction. So there are some interesting benefits to using helium as your coolant. In water reactions, what we have is the water takes off all that heat partially by boiling. Now, this is actually really complicated. As the boiling happens, you get obviously 2 different phases, the liquid and the gas happening in the same place in the reaction. This is really tricky to model and can go really, really wrong under the wrong circumstances. Thankfully, someone's already done a brilliant video on that, so you can check that out somewhere around here. I haven't planned that out yet, but yeah, just go ahead and click on that bad boy. In the case of helium, you just have a gas. No matter how hot you're going to turn it, it's not going to turn into anything other than gas, which means that it's a lot simpler to deal with in the event of an accident. Also, helium is really inert, it's not corrosive, and it doesn't change much when you irradiate it, which means that it's perfect for these difficult conditions. You can get it really hot, you can irradiate it, you can blast it with neutrons, and it's not going to change much. Also, it's really good at soaking up heat. It has a high specific heat capacity, a lot like water, which means you don't need much helium to move a lot of heat away from the reaction. One last advantage is that with helium we can use much higher temperatures at much lower pressures. The current main design for water reactors, something called a pressurized water reactor, unsurprisingly uses very high pressure water at about 150 megapascals. Whereas with a helium reactor, we can get away with something like 7 megapascals. Obviously, having all that pressure in a pressurized water reactor means we have to be very careful about keeping it all contained, and we have to build a big pressure vessel that we don't need for a helium reactor. And helium can get much hotter, which means the reaction is more efficient and we can get more energy out for the same amount of fuel in, which is really helpful. The second thing to note about Amazon's pick for their nuclear reactor, the XE100, is that it runs on this really impressive fuel called triso fuel. Now, triso fuel are these tiny little nuggets that are helium wrapped in silica and graphite. Now, they were developed in the 1960s in Britain in a reactor called the Dragon reactor because, you know, we used to be a real country. What can I say? We had Dragon reactor. The advantage of this is that all this nuclear waste is then kept really safe inside these tiny grains, which are inside this bigger pebble. There are other advantages to doing this as well. Everything involved, both in the tiny grain and the pebble itself, are all ceramics. This means that you can get them mega hot without them melting or having any other kind of serious issue. We can get them to something like 1800 degrees without any problems. So in theory, if they're successful in developing this reactor using a helium coolant and the special triso fuel as well as some other developments, they should be able to create a reactor which is extraordinarily safe using all these kind of passive safety features, as well as able to run very efficiently and use a lot more of its fuel than current types of reactor. So that's what Amazon want to use. Let's take a quick look at what Google want to develop. So on the other side, Google is backing a company called Kairos Power, which are developing a reactor called Hermes. It just, you know, we have to do cool names. This reactor is what's called a molten salt reactor, which means instead of using water like most reactors or helium like the one we just looked at, instead they use molten salt, which is in this case a fluoride salt. This means that, again, like with helium, we don't have to worry about phase change because this would boil at a ridiculously high temperature. Instead, we just have a liquid to deal with, which in a lot of ways is a lot simpler. Also, like helium, we can use much higher temperatures and much lower pressures than for a pressurized water reactor. This means that we can run a reaction more efficiently and in some ways more safely because we don't have to create this huge pressure vessel. Another interesting thing about this design of molten salt reactor is that it's designed to rely on natural circulation in case something goes wrong. This is the same process that radiators use to heat up our house. It just means that a hot fluid is going to rise up and a cold one is going to sink. So in the event that a pump goes to shit, we can use this to keep coolant flowing throughout the core in a disaster or an accident scenario. Again, similar to X Energy, they've adopted for the triso fuel, so they're going for this kind of pebble bed technology as well. In both reactors, this means that we can feed in little pebbles on the top and take them out at the bottom, meaning we don't have to take the reactor offline to refuel it like with most modern pressurized water reactors. Instead, we can just keep a kind of constant process of putting a little bit of fuel in and taking a little bit of spent fuel out. Again, like we said, maximizing uptime and maximizing reliability is so important for these reactors. So to be able to keep the fuel coming in without having to take them offline is really important. And that's what these little triso pebbles let us do. So naturally we have to ask the question, in a fight, who's going to win? Is the Amazon reactor, the X Energy reactor, or Google-backed Kairos reactor the better reactor? Is that even a meaningful question to ask? Well, one thing that we haven't looked at is the challenges that we're going to face between the two. One of the big challenges, of course, helium is just tiny. It's a tiny molecule. It's right up the top there at the periodic table, which means it's a really small one. And that does have physical implications. It gets out through tiny gaps. So building ducting, piping, and turbo machinery, which just means pumps to work with helium, is actually quite a lot more difficult than working with something like water. Of course, this isn't an insurmountable challenge, and people have been working on this for, you know, decades, but scaling it up and making it work as reliably and reproducibly and cheaply as we need is going to be a big challenge for the X Energy team. There are challenges with the Google-backed Kairos reactor as well, not to say that helium is the only problem. Of course, they want to use molten salt, which is, again, mega hot, and so that brings its own material challenges. But there are extra challenges with the materials there, in that, unlike helium, these molten salts in specific conditions can be very corrosive. Also, unlike helium, they're more likely to react when they are hit with neutrons. Again, this isn't an insurmountable challenge. There's been lots of research into how to process and keep these things clean as they're working kind of in the loop, as well as materials that can deal with that corrosion and work in pipes and ducts for those kind of things. But again, that presents this whole big set of challenges that people have been working on for decades. And if it was an easy solve, we would have done it already. Both these reactors are going to have issues that are going to take some time to solve, and they're going to be some of the big problems that the engineers there are going to be facing as they scale these projects up. As we've seen, as we've shown already, that nuclear timelines are slippery at best, and things that are supposed to take years end up taking decades in some situations. But that's not always the case, and it's fair to say that a lot of nuclear projects, especially when they're not first of a kind, are delivered on time and on budget. So it'd be really interesting to see, will they manage to pull that off with these really novel small modular reactors, and what will the implications of that be for the reactor world as a whole? The importance of these developments is, of course, they can take care of the high costs of doing these first of a kind and the R&D development, which means they'll bring down costs for utility companies and smaller other companies that might want to use similar technology in the future. This could drive up adoption if it all works out correctly. Right now, Google's partner Kairos are ahead in development. They've already broken ground on their liquid salt processing facility, and they're the first company in the US to ever get permission to build one of these advanced nuclear reactors. So it's really exciting that they've actually managed to get through that pretty big and litigious process of getting the NRC approval. But with both Kairos and X-Energy, Amazon's partner, receiving so much investment and renewed interest on both an American and global scale of this kind of technology, it's probably fair to say that we can't see the full picture yet for what the future is going to look like and how the race between these two companies is actually going to pan out, because it's only really just been announced. Thank you so much for watching and supporting what we do on this channel. I hope you found something interesting about this video. I'd be really interested to know, do you guys think SMRs is going to be the future of nuclear technology, or renewables, or zero carbon technology as a whole? Or do you think that nuclear is the wrong way to go entirely? Or do you think that we've kind of made up our own problem here with Gen AI and created a useless use of lots of electricity that isn't going to be worth, what, 6% of America's electricity usage in the future? I'd be interested to know what you guys think, and because it's so new, it'd be really interesting to get opinions and start seeing what people think about using these kind of really developmental type of reactor to solve this problem that maybe isn't even a real problem. I don't know. I'm not talking about climate change, I'm talking about generative AI. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and if you enjoyed this, do please remember to subscribe. Love you, bye.